Conflict in Ukraine.
The Russia-Ukraine wars.
The war in Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine.
The Ukraine war.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
The war in Ukraine has been all over the news since the start of the full-scale invasion in February last year. One of the most commonly used rationales behind the invasion is Putin's apprehension of Ukraine's more pro-Western leaning government, and the whole nation as a whole trying to distance itself from the Russian sphere of influence. What this would mean for Putin is that most of its western borders would be surrounded by NATO countries, and that's something he definitely wanted to avoid at all costs. This concept of buffer states between opposing powers is nothing Putin has invented. Its phenomenon has been used in Europe for the most part of the 20th century. This piece of land should serve as a potential battleground which is outside of Russian territory. Yes, this is a very cynical conception, but Russia has always viewed geopolitics as chess, protecting the king at all costs, meaning Moscow, and using the pawns, be it the satellite states or just soldiers in general, as disposable material. And Ukraine has not been the first country to receive such sort of military support from Russia as soon as it started diverting from Russia's influence. So, in today's video, we would like to dive deeper into the history of Russian war efforts, namely the war in Georgia and Chechnya, and compare it to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. This should help us grasp the bigger picture of Russia's geopolitical intentions, and also untangle the mystery of why the war in Ukraine is not going according to plan, while the previous Russian military endeavors were relatively successful. War in Chechnya. Okay, so first things first, we need to have a look at where's Chechnya actually located. It's a landlocked piece of land located in the North Caucasus region, officially called the Chechen Republic, bordering Georgia in the south, and otherwise being completely surrounded by Russian territory. It's also, unlike most of Russia, Muslim, and is also rich in both oil and natural gas, which has always made regions more prone to war, wouldn't you say? Anyways, following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, many regions in Russia sought greater autonomy or independence. Chechnya, which has had a distinct cultural identity and had been historically oppressed by Moscow, was no exception. There has always been a strong nationalist movement present, and the years of oppression made the people see independence as a means of preserving their nation. So, the Chechen parliament declared independence from Russia in 1991, in a move that was not recognized by Moscow. You see, these were really turbulent times in the whole former Soviet bloc, and Russia did not really have the strength to somehow reattach Chechnya immediately after its declared independence. But they did not have to wait long for Moscow's response, as just 3 years afterwards, in 1994, a war broke out between the Russian forces and the Chechen rebels, led by the late separatist leader Dzhokhar Dudayev. The war ended in 1996 with a ceasefire, and the establishment of the de facto independent Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, which means Russia did not really fulfill its mission. But we must say that the Chechen side suffered significant losses, with estimates ranging from 30,000 to 100,000. No official numbers were provided. As horrible as this war was, the peace was short-lived, and in 1999, Russia launched a second military campaign in Chechnya, led by the newly appointed Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin. The war was prompted by a series of bombings in Russia, including a bombing of an apartment building in Moscow that killed over 300 people. Russian officials blamed Chechen militants for the attacks and launched a new military campaign to crush the separatist movement and bring Chechnya back under Russian control. It is clear that the shift in power in the Kremlin, from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin, changed Russia's geopolitical strategy, making it clear that Russia is not going to tolerate any sort of separatism or disobedience. The war, which lasted until 2009, a whopping 10 years, was marked by intense fighting, human rights abuses, and the rise of Islamist insurgency groups such as the Caucasus Emirate. Again, the exact numbers of casualties and damage caused by the conflict are difficult to determine, due to the lack of reliable data, but the losses were in the tens of thousands on the Chechen side, and in the thousands on the Russian side. Hundreds of thousands of people were also forced to flee the region to the neighboring republics. So the war did end with the Russian government claiming victory over the separatist movement. Chechnya was brought under tighter control of Russia, and a pro-Moscow puppet government was installed, led by no other than Ramzan Kadyrov, a former rebel who switched sides during the conflict. Often called the Chechen Butcher, Kadyrov has been accused of human rights abuses, including torture, extrajudicial killings, and disappearances. Horrible stuff we are now also witnessing in Ukraine. This did not stop Kadyrov from maintaining his grip on power through a combination of loyalty to the Kremlin and his own security apparatus. He is known to be a close friend of Putin. And what can we say? Birds of a feather flock together. Anyhow, in recent years, Chechnya has become a more stable region, with the Kremlin investing heavily in infrastructure projects, similar to what was done in Crimea after 2014. And surprisingly, they started promoting traditional Islamic values. So, despite the duration of the war and the fact that the situation in Chechnya is still far from ideal, Putin got what he wanted: a loyal, semi-stable federal republic, which is far from being able of establishing any meaningful separatist movements. So, now that we've got Chechnya covered, let's move on to the next part of this video, the Russian war in Georgia. In the summer of 2008, while the fighting in Chechnya was still going on, Russia started another military campaign, actually not far from Chechnya, but in Georgia. The situation was a little more complex. Again, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the region of South Ossetia gained independence. Georgia has never recognized South Ossetia's sovereignty, and the same can be said about the majority of the global community. So in August 2008, Georgian forces launched a military operation with the objective to regain control over the region, claiming that the separatists started attacking villages in Georgian territory. In response, Russia sent troops into South Ossetia and also Abkhazia, another breakaway region of Georgia, declaring that they are protecting the separatists, who were often ethnic Russians. The war only lasted 5 days and ended up with Russian troops occupying both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But was this really the reason behind Russia's invasion? You see, before 2008, the Georgian government was shifting away from pro-Russian views to more pro-Western ones. Since the late 90s, Georgia has been trying to divert from Russia, putting a lot of effort into becoming a member of NATO. Georgia saw the West as a more prospective partner in both economic and military cooperation. Remember that despite its natural wealth, the Russian economy, if measured by its GDP, is roughly the size of Italy's economy. The investments from the EU could have largely benefited Georgia in its economic development. Despite the accession criteria of both NATO and the EU being fairly strict, Georgia actually applied for NATO membership in 2004, and its efforts to become a candidate state of the EU were apparent. But guess what NATO's membership criteria include? The need for stable and peaceful relations with its neighbors, which basically translates to an internationally recognized borderline and no separatist regions, which Georgia potentially could have if South Ossetia was joined with Georgia, or if they both minded their business and recognized it. But for now, its accession into NATO is just completely out of the question. This was, in our opinion, the true objective of the Russian annexation of the two separatist regions: destabilize Georgia, which would disallow its integration with the West. As you could have guessed by the recent protest in Georgia, Georgia has not been politically stable, with the leader of the strongest political party, Georgian Dream, apart from being the richest man in Georgia, also has deep ties with the Kremlin. There have been many reports of large-scale corruption, coming namely from Russia or China. We will see where the future takes Georgia, but given the scale of the recent protests, which were targeting the pro-Russian politicians, the mood in local society is definitely not as anti-Western as Putin would like. Comparison summary. So, what can these two, or more precisely 3 conflicts have to teach us about the war in Ukraine? We would say it is mainly that Russia still considers itself a superpower, and that it can't bear any formerly friendly turning its back on them. It is also a sign of demonstrating power. be it suppressing a separatist movement in one of its republics, aka the war in Chechnya, or breaking the territorial integrity of a neighboring state that wants to join an unfriendly alliance, aka the annexation of Georgian territories. And how does Ukraine fit into this puzzle? Well, what Russia did in 2014 when the war technically started was secure a strategically important port in Crimea, Sevastopol, and, maybe more importantly, it broke Ukraine's territorial integrity, very similar to how they did it in Georgia. Even their rationale was similar, to help Russian citizens in Donbass. The reason why this time the war is so much more costly than any of the aforementioned wars is, of course, much more complicated, but in a nutshell, we think that Putin expected the situation to be very similar to that in Georgia regarding speed. Remember, the conflict in Georgia only lasted a couple of days, and similar to Chechnya in terms of the outcome. You see, most reports suggest that Putin wanted a brisk invasion whose objective was to install a puppet, pro-Russian government in Kiev, not a full-on war, which would be dragging on for so long and is now costing Putin money. Money he and his oligarch friends could have spent on yachts and weird-looking mansions. But what do you think? Let us know in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. And have a good one.